Tonight from Kingston Penitentiary, 3 lifers who made it to the outside their way. The gangster who cut a deal. The tragic boy who made his own way out. The innocent, redeemed by truth. Good evening, I'm Lyndon McIntyre. In 2 years, this place will be closed for good. Each of the thousands of inmates who have passed through here in nearly 180 years, a tragic footnote in the country's history. Lives derailed, lives lost. Tonight, 3 uniquely personal stories, convicts that we got to know well at the Fifth Estate, how they got in here, and in the end, how they got out. He was a banker's worst nightmare, whose escapades would inspire a recent movie, Citizen Gangster.
We are the Boyd Gang. Welcome to the show.
And a media celebrity.
Welcome to the Daily Star. You're a decent family man. You're a decorated soldier. What went wrong?
Life's way too short. It was time to start living.
Edwin Alonzo Boyd. But his reputation as a handsome, charismatic bank robber concealed an ugly secret he protected for over half a century.
I did a few things that could have got me hung.
I first met Edwin Alonzo Boyd in 1995 when he agreed to sit down with the Fifth Estate for his very first television interview. Of course, I remembered him from the 50s and 60s as a glamorous old gangster, and so it was a pretty friendly conversation when we finally met.
Yeah, that was one of the problems with me, was that I was always looking for something that made me stand out.
The war would give him plenty of chances to stand out and to learn skills he'd later turn to crime.
And I had to learn to be good at unarmed combat, and when I got a reputation for being, you know, really adept at that kind of thing, they put me doing more of that than anything else.
When Eddie came home, he got a job with the Toronto Transit Commission. But after a depression and a war, peace meant only one thing to Eddie Boyd: boredom. Then one day he read a newspaper story about a $69,000 holdup by a robber who was, in modern parlance, challenged.
They didn't put him in jail, they just took the money off him and took it back, and he was handicapped mentally. And so that right away, that sparked a thought in my mind: if it's so easy to rob a bank like that, what the hell am I working for?
The city was sprouting banks, and Boyd had the perfect training for overwhelming their flimsy security, time spent among commandos in the war. I've talked to people who have robbed banks, and they tell me that there's a special kind of a thrill to it. What was it for you?
Just the money. I just enjoyed the money.
Hello, ladies. Money, money, money. Let's go, let's go, let's go.
Would you have started shooting if they'd given you a hard time? Do you think you had it in you to shoot those people?
I didn't want to shoot anyone. All I wanted to do was scare them enough to get the money, which usually it worked out all right, see? Once in a while they'd shoot at me and I'd take off.
Everybody down!
Boyd's notoriety just grew as the years went by, but his gang actually became quite infamous for bank robberies, wild shootouts, in particular for a couple of daring escapes from the Don jail in Toronto. The infamy became rather serious when 2 of the gang murdered a police officer in Toronto and were subsequently hanged for it. Through it all, Boyd's image remained comparatively pure, even when he ended up in Kingston Penitentiary to serve 8 life sentences for his part in the various crimes. He's still remembered around Kingston Pen, particularly by a former warden there named Monty Burke.
It was a tough jail. It was a tough jail, but he did his own time. I don't think he was really bothered much. He was a solid con in the sense of he was a bank robber, which is at the top of the hierarchy, at least it was in those days. And he educated himself and so on. So he was looking beyond prison.
He was a solid con, but the prospect of all those years here in Kingston Pen eventually got to him. In 1962, after 10 years, he won parole, according to reports, after he broke a basic rule in the convict code by providing information to the authorities who were investigating the murder in 1961 of a popular prison guard. For more than 30 years, he just disappeared until we found him in 1995, a sedate senior citizen living in a modest bungalow near Victoria, BC. He was an extremely fit man in his 80s.
I get so I can keep my body in good shape.
I bet you could still go over the wall at the Don Dale today.
Oh, it'd be no trouble to it. It'd be easy. In fact, it'd probably be easier now than it was then, because I'd know what I was doing. So.
For nearly 35 years, he looked after 2 disabled women, one of whom he married.
Are you ready to eat, Marjorie?
Not quite.
He'd met his wife while driving a bus for disabled people.
My perception of Eddie Boyd at the time was that he was a success story. He returned to the community. There was no conviction for reoffending. He looked after these women.
Very nice.
You like that?
Yeah.
I thought he was a success story, too. I remember getting an autograph for my mother. But after we were finished with our story, the producer, the late Brian Valley, continued to talk to Edwin Alonzo Boyd for a book he wanted to write. And the more they talked, the more there emerged a darker Eddie Boyd and a darker story than anybody could ever have imagined.
When I got back to Toronto and was working
for the TTC.
after I left the TTC,
Oh yeah.
I did a few things that could have got me hung, but I just kind of didn't mention them, and I didn't think about them. So.
What do you mean, like murders?
Yeah.
Turned out that one night he was out rehearsing criminal activity of some kind, and he was in a Lover's Lane area in Toronto, and he surprised a couple parked there. There was a confrontation, and in his conversations with Brian Valley, he left little doubt about what happened next.
They were sounding off what they were going to do, and I decided that it'd be better for me to dispatch them. They were going to turn me in.
During the war, Eddie Boyd had instructed commandos in unarmed combat tactics. And when he confronted the couple parked in Toronto, he put some of his training to work, obviously.
Decided that I'd put them in the trunk of the car. And that's what I did. Left the car in Hyde Park. Nobody got any problem with it except that the people that I had to do away with.
According to psychiatrists, Eddie Boyd fit the classic clinical definition of a psychopath. He was very charming. He was also ruthless, and during his long life, he fooled many, many people, including me. Shortly after that confession, Eddie Boyd died, thus avoiding prosecution, at least in this world. When we come back, a friend who chose death over life in Kingston Pen. Welcome back. The story of Kingston Penitentiary is a litany of human failure. Tonight, the stories of 3 of the many inmates we've got to know here over the years, one of whom became a close friend. Tyrone Kahn made history in 1999 with the first escape from Kingston Penitentiary in 40 years. A moment of glory that became an epilogue in a short and tragic life.
I was in my office here at 7:15, 7:12, and received a phone call from the correctional supervisor's office that a line was spotted over the wall. That's, frankly, a warden's worst nightmare. I gave 2 names. Check those cells. check Ty Kahn's cell and in another inmate's cell.
In the news this morning, looking for Tyrone Kahn. The authorities
Tyrone
found
Kahn was last seen in his cell.
Modern-day Houdini has become the only inmate to escape.
Probable feat Kahn managed to pull off here.
The last time I saw Ty Kahn was here in Kingston Penitentiary in 1999. He was living on a range like this one. By then I knew his story pretty well after 5 years of visits, letters, and telephone conversations. The first time I met him was in another institution after he wrote to us about a story we had done on the Fifth Estate.
The overriding emotion I feel in response to your program is sorrow. I feel that he is being abused in that setting. And sadly, I see him possibly ending up where I am.
He was deeply affected by our story, which was about a boy who was living in an environment of extreme verbal and psychological abuse. Ty Kahn was convinced that if the abuse continued, the kid named Evan would end up following the same criminal path that he did. He was particularly upset by one scene between the boy and his parents over a missing dime.
I'm short, you're a dime to the good. I'm missing my key to my room where I'm missing the dime. You explain it to me so I understand.
I watched your show that aired on April 12, '94, and it outlined the interaction between parents and problematic children. A surveillance camera had been installed in a household.
Evan, don't get me mad. You will spend the next fucking 7 months on that fucking bed.
I was shocked and quite angered by the behavior of the father.
Oh, I'm gonna fucking kill him. You better start telling the truth right now.
Right fucking now!
The thing that angered me the most was the situation in which Evan was blamed for stealing a key and a dime.
We know exactly everything you did today.
I was struck by the resemblance between him and I.
I'm gonna hit him.
As the show progressed, it became more and more apparent that I was essentially the same as he when I was that age.
The thing that struck us about the approach he made was that he was, at the time, 27 years old, and he was doing a cumulative prison sentence of 47 years. There was something odd about that, and we decided to follow up by meeting him and talking to him and finding out just how he got into such a predicament. What in the name of God are you doing in here, facing 40-odd years of incarceration?
I just got into a behavior pattern that stuck for a while.
How did you get into such a pattern?
Well, I ended up on my own. The only foreseeable way, the welfare was around, but it didn't seem to do much of a trick. People that I was hanging around with were involved in petty crimes. I seemed to progress a little above that. Instead of doing B&Es and stuff, I ended up getting a hold of a gun and doing a robbery, which was, of course, a much quicker way to get cash.
Well, I thought that there was a lot of good in the guy. He was an intelligent, decent human being, and he took full ownership of everything he did. But at the same time, when you looked at the documentation of his life, it revealed all sorts of flaws and failures by social agencies that are supposed to sort of help young people get from troubled childhood to some form of functional adulthood. And in Ty Kahn's case, everything seemed to break down at every step of his life. Ty Kahn's mom was only 16 when he was born. He was adopted as an infant into a home where he felt unwanted for all the time he was there. He was subjected to abuse. He eventually became the scapegoat for everything that seemed to go wrong in a household that was very dysfunctional.
I thought I was one of them till I think my adoptive mother brought up the fact that I was adopted, and she sort of said it like, you think you're special because you're adopted. I didn't even know what adopted was. I had no idea what it was. And I mean, I think she had problems, so I knew, I thought that she hated me.
He was subjected to a lot of bizarre punishments. He described one in which he was made to stand on his tiptoes with a paring knife underneath his heels so that he'd stay on his toes. He talked a lot about having been locked up in his room with no access to food or a toilet. He was always being singled out for blame and for criticism, all of which he'd later confided to me and to my colleague, a producer here at the Fifth Estate, Teresa Burke.
When you look back at his childhood, you can see that he already establishes a pattern, and the three main elements that form the wheel of his life are set. He would steal something. He'd be punished for stealing something by being confined, and then he would escape when he got tired of being confined. In the 8 years that Ty lived with the Kahns, there was no monitoring by the Children's Aid Society and no visits from social workers.
Looking back, what is your most painful memory?
Finding out that they were intending to perform a Crown Wardship hearing. Because then I knew there was no going back. There was no returning from a group home for a small period of time and then going back home. I knew that there was no more. It was basically like I was up for adoption again. In fact, that's what it says on the documents.
And of course, at this time, you're how old?
11.
What did you need that you weren't getting?
Some sort of show. To show that you were wanted or something, that you weren't just an inconvenience or a problem all the time.
Are you trying to say that what you needed was some evidence that you were loved?
Yeah.
Why can't you say that?
Who knows?
Once they moved him to Ontario, to Millhaven Penitentiary, we'd see each other a few times a year. I got a phone call from Ty Kahn one afternoon in the spring of 1998 from Millhaven Penitentiary. He was in trouble. Like the old bank robber Eddie Boyd, Ty Kahn had become an informer. He'd told the authorities about plans for a particularly violent prison escape, and the convicts found out about it. So he had to be removed from Millhaven, and the next time I saw him, he was in Kingston Penitentiary in protective custody. There were bureaucratic factors, concerns about his background as an escape artist. Whatever the cause, he got stuck in Kingston Penitentiary for a lot longer than anybody thought he would be. And over the months, you could see him becoming increasingly bitter. He had risked his life, as he saw it, for society, and the reward was to be in the worst penitentiary in the country. Over time, he told Teresa Burke in a letter that he had given up on the system and that he planned to take matters into his own hands.
He would sleep in a certain position on his bunk. So for a month, at least a month, maybe longer, when the officers were doing the wines, and they would get accustomed to him. And then when he escaped, he had the dummy set up in the same way. He had a radio he'd taken apart, the speakers, and he hooked a microphone to an adjacent cell so that someone in another cell could grunt or something when the officer comes by and speaks to him. Kahn worked in the canvas repair shop. He hid in the shop area. When the shop was cleared and the officer locked the shop, that's when Ty Kahn was building his escape apparatus, and there were racks of steel shelving in there. He disassembled that. He used mail bags to muffle the ladder, because it's like an aluminum ladder, a steel ladder, it makes noise. When the time was right, he was able to drop this ladder down from the second story of the shop and come down and take the ladder along and at the corner of the wall. So we scurried up the ladder, went to the top, rappelled down.
I was at work early one morning, and I had a phone call from home. Ty Kahn had just phoned in. And it was probably about 7 o'clock in the morning, and I didn't think that prison inmates were allowed to make phone calls out that hour of the day. And my wife said, no, he's out. Hey, what do you mean he's out? He broke out of prison. It was the last chance I'd ever have had to talk to him, but I missed it. The police eventually cornered Ty Kahn in a basement apartment in Toronto. They tried to track me down. They couldn't find me. Eventually, they found Teresa Burke, the Fifth Estate producer who'd also become his friend.
Regarding Tyrone Kahn.
He was crying. He said that he wouldn't go back. He was upset, and he was also sick. He started to move through the apartment, and he had calmed down by that time, and I could hear it in his voice that he wasn't crying, and he was telling the police outside, "I'm not lining up a shot. I'm going to move into the next room." He started to move towards a chair, and he said, "I'm going to sit down in the chair. Is that okay?" And they said, "Yeah, that's fine, Ty." And I could hear him sort of turn. He said a couple of words, and I thought, this is really good. He's sitting down, he's settling in for a conversation. And he said a couple of words of a sentence, and then I heard a really low shot.
I'm pretty firmly convinced it was an accident. He was balancing a shotgun in one hand and a cell phone in the other hand. He tried to sit down, lost his balance, and the shotgun went off. I think it was as stupid and tragic as that. When we come back, what happens when justice goes astray?
Obviously, this system's allowed to pound away until they get what they want, even if it ends up to put an innocent man behind bars. Milgard, Marshall, and who else? More.
In the long history of Kingston Penitentiary, the lowest form of life has always been the skinner, the molester of children. In 1992, I met a very scared young man in here. His name was Guy Paul Morin. He'd been convicted of the rape and murder of a little girl. He insisted he was innocent. The child that he was accused of killing was 9 years old. Her name was Christine Jessup. Within hours of her disappearance, hundreds of volunteers fanned out across the countryside. But as the hours became days, then weeks, then months, the fear crystallized.
Christine?
You could hear it in the voice of Christine's father, Bob Jessup.
She wouldn't hurt anybody. Just wouldn't hurt anybody at all.
89 days after she disappeared, they found her body. It was New Year's Eve. She'd been raped, then mutilated. The Jessup family, right from the outset, believed that Christine had been taken from home, which caused the focus of the early investigation to be on people who lived nearby, neighbors, like the family of Al and Ida Morin, and in particular their son, Guy Paul.
They were a very strange family.
Christine's adopted brother, Kenny.
They were up all night, working in the yard.
What did you think of Guy Paul Morin before all this happened?
He just seemed odd.
Odd. A small town view of people who were working outdoors under living room lamps the night everybody else searched for little Christine Jessup. Odd. A family whose affection for each other made the neighbors nervous. Odd. Guy Paul Morin's idea of a good time was looking after beehives.
You ready? Yep, I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm lifting. Got it? No dropping.
Fixing up old cars. Playing old-fashioned music on the clarinet. And one of the investigating police officers would famously observe in his notes that Guy Paul was a weird-type guy. One phrase that would characterize the rest of the investigation, and it would continue to point this finger of guilt at Guy Paul Morin.
They said, well, you're under arrest for the murder of Christine Jessup, your neighbor. I said, right, come on, guys, you're kidding. He said, no, Guy, we're not. We know what we're doing. We don't make mistakes.
They handcuffed him and drove him to a Durham police station in Whitby.
They were determined to prove guilt no matter what the evidence. By the time they brought him in, his fate was sealed.
And then I was brought into a small room. And there was that's the room I stayed in for all of 6.5 hours.
In the room, there was a large blow-up of his fingerprint. The police told him it came from Christine's clothes.
They are your fingerprints. They are on her clothing, and that's your fingerprint up there. And I said, it's impossible. I have never touched that child.
The media played a big role in perpetuating the stereotype of Guy Paul Morin as weirdo, pervert, and ultimately killer. It was never more emphatically illustrated to me than one day as I was leaving Kingston Penitentiary after spending time talking to Guy Paul Morin. One of the officers asked what my impression was, and I said, well, he's pretty persuasive. And the same officer smiled and says, come back next week and we'll let you in to see Clifford Olson. He's even more persuasive. This is just the way they saw him. It was a cynical view of the guy that I have to say didn't last much more than 15 minutes after you sat down and talked to him. And one of the people most profoundly affected by Guy Paul Morin, and one who would continue to be obsessed with his case probably for the rest of his life, was a highly unlikely individual, an ex-cop turned private eye by the name of Basil Mangano.
I met Guy Paul within 5 days of his being charged. I got hired by his first attorneys, and I went in to interview him thinking that the police must have had, a lot of evidence against him. So I met him, and I interviewed him for about 3 hours, and I kept testing him. I kept watching for body language. I lied to him and told him there was laser technology that if he touched her body or her clothing, they would be able to find out. And he didn't flinch.
I know I'm not the killer. They can say all they want, but I know I'm not the killer.
And after 3 hours, I came out of there thinking either he's a really great actor or there's something different here. So I decided to look at the evidence.
And one of the pieces of evidence they used was a blow-up of that fingerprint that he would have been led to believe came from some aspect of the crime scene, whereas in fact they had taken it from his clarinet.
When you again look at the evidence that was there when he got charged, you gotta think that they must have thought he would crack. We're gonna get a confession from him.
And they said, look, just be easy on yourself and just let it out. It'll save your parents lots of dollars. It'll cost your parents within a 6-digit range. And how they were right about that.
There were other factors, hair and fiber, that it would turn out over time to have very little credibility. Not only was key evidence in the case misinterpreted, a lot of it was deliberately manipulated, some of it was even falsified. Important evidence that might have been helpful to Guy Paul Morin's defense just disappeared. Investigators at one stage became so desperate that they actually recruited a couple of jailhouse snitches.
The guy in the cell with Guy Paul was a pathological liar.
As it turned out in his first trial, the jury didn't believe a word that came out of the mouths of those two jailhouse informants, and they really didn't take seriously the evidence of hair and fiber and various other things that the Crown brought against him. And at the end of that trial, he walked out of the courthouse a free man.
At 20 minutes after 4 this afternoon, 26-year-old Guy Paul Morin became a free man.
Well, I'm very, very happy for the verdict that has come out from the jury.
The system does prove to be quite effective. It has proven me as I am innocent.
For the Jessup family, a living hell continues.
And about the only comment we can make is that we've lived a year and a half of hell, and it's going to go on.
I don't think he could have realized just how long it was going to go on. The Crown appealed the not guilty verdict. Then, of course, the defense appealed the various appeals, and it went on for a number of years like that. When it eventually came down to a second murder trial, that trial itself would go on for a whole year. A lot of the same evidence, a lot of the same characters performing once again before quite a different jury, and in the end, quite a different verdict.
Guilty of first-degree murder. Guy Paul Moran sat quietly in the courtroom. He didn't move a muscle as the verdict was read. Christine Jessup's parents, Bob Jessup and his estranged wife, Janet Jessup, both say they're relieved that justice has finally been done.
Christine would never be back with us. And the only consolation of the whole affair is that it's finally put to rest.
Ironically, a key moment in that second trial would be the testimony by those two jailhouse snitches, who in the first trial had no credibility whatsoever, had been discounted by the jury. In the second trial, because of the way they were presented by the Crown as honest citizens voluntarily coming forth to testify with nothing to gain and everything to lose, they had an enormous impact on the second jury, as we found out when we tracked down and talked to some of those jurors.
Juror Gary Coyle.
The two inmates, even though...
This is the alleged confession.
The alleged confession, yeah. To me, these people went through hell in that trial to give evidence that they didn't have to give. They didn't have to be there.
Juror Al Baxter.
They were given the option not to appear, and they did appear and they did testify, and because of that, they became more credible. Even though they, by personality, they weren't credible.
I looked at my jury. Not one of them faced me. One had tears in her eyes. I looked at my defense. Wow. I did hear properly. We find the accused, Guy Paul Moran, guilty of first-degree murder. Yeah, I remember those words. Obviously, this system's allowed to pound away until they get what they want, even if it ends up to put an innocent man behind bars. And here's the case. One of many, I'm sure. Milgard, Marshall, and who else? Moran.
I remember his despair, but he couldn't have known in that dark moment that public opinion had already begun to shift. A book by the justice reporter Kirk Macon and our documentary would later contribute to widespread public doubt about his conviction. And when he appealed that conviction, it became clear just how widespread were the doubts about his guilt. The courts agreed to set him free while reconsidering his case.
He was released on bail. Among his top priorities, a visit to his beehives to see how they survived his absence.
They're alive.
How can you tell?
You can hear the if you actually give it a slight knock like this.
Honest to God.
You hear them all buzzing slightly?
Yeah.
Fine hum. Did you hear that?
I don't believe it.
You heard that?
Yes, I did.
Most people who go to Kingston Penitentiary with the kind of conviction you had don't get along all that well, and yet you were a popular guy in there. How come?
When I went into the range the first day, I was petrified. I didn't even know what to expect. But I can assure you, those guys treated me really with respect. They said it clearly to me, like, Moran, if there's anything, we know you don't fit in here, first of all, and you should not be here.
What did they know that the justice system didn't know?
They know this happens. They followed Milgard's. They followed Marshall. And innocence prevails. They can see it.
It would turn out that those convicts had greater insight into things than anybody else in the justice system. Guy Paul Moran would be clearly and unquestionably exonerated of the crime as a result of DNA testing and declared innocent. When we come back, if Guy Paul Morin didn't kill Christine Jessup, who did?
We've missed a lot of opportunities, but we still have things that we can do to narrow the field of suspects, and then maybe it will get solved. I think it's still solvable.
In the end, Guy Paul Morin didn't have to spend a whole lot of time behind these walls. But what still sickens people who are affected by the case is that someone who should have spent the best part of his life in here never did. It's a failure that still haunts the private eye who has spent the last 28 years obsessed by what he sees as the ultimate injustice. Someone got away with murdering a little girl named Christine Jessup.
Have the most heinous crime one could have in society. The savage killing of an innocent child. Over the years, I've never been able to forget about the case. And since Guy Paul's exoneration, when I had thought about it, I've only thought about what can be done to somehow find who had perpetrated this crime. We've missed a lot of opportunities, but we still have things that we can do to narrow the field of suspects and possibly have the public come forward and maybe help out a little bit. And then maybe it will get solved. I think it's still solvable. It began all in this corner. That's where it first went wrong. We know that Christine Jessup was last seen entering the Queensville General Store. Where it went wrong was that there was a 16-year-old witness that very quickly, within days, told the police that Christine was seen by her walking up the street here, Leslie Street, to her home, which is just up at the crest of the hill. Years later, she came forward and said that she had made that up, that she'd been looking for attention. What we do have is another witness who had planned to go with Christine after school to this park to my left. And this was disregarded by the police because of the false statement by the older witness. The investigation was focused on Christine having been abducted from her home. And that's where the investigation first went off the rails. The most likely location for Christine to have gone after leaving this Queensville General Store was to this parkette. It's a short walk along Queensville Side Road, and as you can see, there are a number of houses that face the parkette. We are standing in the parking lot of the parkette, and we have the potential for all these witnesses in these homes. They may have seen a vehicle, the little girl, someone acting a little bit different.
One of the most persuasive aspects of the case Basil Mangano was making on behalf of Guy Paul Morin was the location where the body was eventually found, which was 55 kilometers away from where she was last seen. It seemed to him, and it seems logical, especially now, that this body site, as it was called, should have been a major focus of initial investigation.
Well, the most direct route to the body site, and it's not a straight line, would have been to go up north on Leslie Street from the Queensville Side Road, which we're on now, and turning off at a street called Ravenshoe Side Road, and that you would take eastbound quite a distance. We're going 55 kilometers approximately to the 4th concession in Brock Township. There's a lot of growth along the side. You didn't see the fence out 28 years ago. This was just a tractor trail going to some fields.
It was pretty obvious that whoever took Christine to this place was familiar with the place, somebody that was reasonably confident that the place was going to be vacant. This was always puzzling to Basil Mangano.
Certainly, Christine's body was found just north of a trailer that had been parked here. There was a vehicle that had been parked just north of the body site. So anyone driving up here would see a vehicle, would see the trailer, and would have to know that no one was going to be on the property that evening.
Even after almost 30 years, 2 major police investigations, 2 trials, public inquiry, continuing public interest, Basil Mangano was confident that the perpetrator is still there, still waiting to be caught, a confidence that seems to be shared by the police, who continue to keep the file open. Detective Sergeant Steve Ryan.
I've got tremendous hope that we will see the day when this case is solved. The big part of this whole investigation now is the fact that we do have DNA. So what we require is a name. That proverbial phone call, we are literally 1 phone call away from solving this case with the assistance of the general public.
It could well be that they're just a phone call away from clearing up a murder that's now almost 30 years old. Somebody somewhere has a very dark secret, or somebody somewhere knows someone who has or had a very dark secret. It took Edwin Alonzo Boyd nearly 50 years to confess to 2 murders that he committed. The impulse to clear a guilty conscience is a motivation that lingers for a very, very long time. I had a long chat with Guy Paul Morin recently. He's raising a family in Ontario. He's working at 2 full-time jobs, struggling to live normally and privately after too many years in the glare of public scrutiny. The Fifth Estate returns after this. Welcome back. Now here's a look at what's coming up on the Fifth Estate.
I'm Gillian Findlay. It could yet prove the most expensive defense purchase in Canadian history.
The Government of Canada is committing today to acquire 65 Joint Strike Fighter F-35 Lightning II aircraft.
$25 billion and counting for what the military promises will be the best fighter jets available.
We believe that it was a fair competition that took place and that the correct aircraft was selected.
But there wasn't a competition, not a Canadian one.
To mislead Canadians by saying we participated in it when we did not. And this meets our needs. It's a complete fabrication, distortion of the truth.
Was Canada pressured to buy the F-35? Did the government cover up the true costs to win an election?
The department did not provide Parliament with complete cost information or fully inform decision makers about the risks of this program.
Will taxpayers be funding an albatross for decades to come?
So what is it good at?
It's not good at anything. It's a turkey.
That's the story of Canada and the F-35 next week on the Fifth Estate.
That's our program for this week. I'm Lyndon McIntyre. For everyone here at the Fifth Estate, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.